In the winter of 1954, at the dawn of the Cold War's most paranoid decade, a small circle of CIA officers gathered in a windowless room beneath West Berlin, staring at a set of blueprints so insane, so ambitious, that even the engineers involved doubted it could ever work. A plan to dig a secret tunnel across one of the most heavily surveilled borders on Earth and tap directly into Soviet military communication lines without the Red Army ever realizing the Americans were listening. This operation, later codenamed Gold, was the CIA's boldest intelligence gamble of the decade, born from a desperate U.S. desire to know what the Kremlin was planning as tensions in Europe surged, and nuclear weapons were becoming central to every military conversation. Berlin, after all, was the perfect listening post, a divided city where the Soviets, British, Americans, and French lived elbow to elbow, separated not by continents, but by a few hundred meters, and where Soviet Army headquarters transmitted a constant stream of radio and landline messages detailing troop movements, supply schedules, political directives, and secret orders that the CIA could only dream of intercepting. And yet, among the officers studying those blueprints, there was one truth none of them knew. The KGB already knew everything, because sitting inside British intelligence at that very moment was one of the most devastating double agents of the entire Cold War. A soft-spoken, charming, and utterly ruthless MI6 officer named George Blake, a man who had already betrayed dozens of operations and hundreds of assets to the Soviets, and who, as soon as he saw the plan for Operation Gold, quietly informed his KGB handler that the Americans were preparing to dig a tunnel under East Berlin. This twist, this perfect storm of ambition, espionage, secrecy, and betrayal is what makes Operation Gold one of the most extraordinary stories of the entire Cold War. Because while the CIA and British SIS poured millions of dollars and tens of thousands of man-hours into building the tunnel, the Soviets chose not to expose it immediately. Instead, they let the tunnel remain intact, allowed the Americans to spy on their cables, and fed those cables with controlled information, all while waiting for the perfect moment to stage its discovery in a way that embarrassed the West without revealing their mole. But in 1954, as the first shovels of dirt were moved, the Americans knew none of this. What they knew was that Berlin was a chessboard, the Soviets were winning, and intelligence gaps were widening by the day. The CIA desperately needed reliable information, and to get it, they turned to an operation previously attempted successfully by the British in Vienna, Operation Silver, a smaller cable-tapping tunnel under Soviet facilities in Austria that had yielded valuable communications. Berlin, however, was far more complex. The soil was swampy, the water table high, and Soviet patrols relentless. But Bill Harvey, the legendary CIA counterintelligence officer who oversaw the Berlin base, was determined to execute the plan. Harvey was a heavy-drinking, chain-smoking, brutally intelligent figure whose methods were often aggressive but effective. He understood Berlin's chaotic espionage landscape better than almost anyone, and he believed that the only way to break Soviet secrecy was to physically tap into the primary communications artery linking Red Army headquarters to Moscow. The plan required constructing a tunnel 450 meters long, starting from a warehouse disguised as a communications facility in West Berlin and extending under a Soviet-controlled road into East Berlin. The tunnel needed to be large enough for technicians to crawl through, but small enough to avoid seismic detection, reinforced to avoid collapse, and silent enough that Soviet border guards would never hear the drilling. It took more than 1,200 tons of equipment, custom-built hydraulic drills, and months of night shift labor to hollow out the passage. Workers hauled dirt away in sealed trucks to avoid attracting suspicion, while engineers installed oxygen circulation systems, temperature controls, and vibration dampeners so sensitive that even footsteps were carefully controlled. The tunnel grew inch by inch, often delayed by flooding or unexpected soil shifts, and every measurement had to be precise, because deviating even a meter off course risked breaking into the wrong cellar or hitting a Soviet pipeline. By early 1955, after months of exhausting underground labor, the CIA finally reached the communications cables. Tapping them required a team of highly trained cable experts who entered the tunnel through a locked hatch inside the false warehouse, squeezed through the narrow passage, and worked in near-total darkness to clamp induction coils around the Soviet landlines. Once the taps were active, the signals were routed through shielded wires back to the listening post in West Berlin, where linguists and analysts began the painstaking task of translating thousands of intercepted messages. To the CIA's astonishment, the operation worked flawlessly. Soviet military units transmitted operational plans, intelligence reports, personal messages, and internal administrative chatter, an avalanche of information that analysts devoured eagerly. At Langley, the tunnel was celebrated as a monumental triumph of engineering and espionage, the kind of operation that could rewrite U.S. understanding of Soviet strategy in Central Europe. Politicians were briefed, analysts were promoted. The CIA considered Operation Gold the crown jewel of Berlin intelligence. But all the while, the KGB smiled quietly from the shadows. Because from the very moment the tunnel plan was approved, George Blake had informed them. Blake was more than just a spy. He was ideological, believing deeply in communism after witnessing the devastation of the Korean War. His betrayal of Operation Gold was not transactional, it was enthusiastic. And the KGB, recognizing the opportunity, chose a strategy more cunning than any CIA officer could have imagined. They let the tunnel operate. Instead of immediately shutting it down, which would expose Blake and eliminate access to Western thinking, the Soviets altered their communication patterns. Sensitive messages were rerouted to alternate channels, while others were deliberately fed into the tapped lines to mislead Western analysts. For nearly a year, the CIA believed it was penetrating the heart of Soviet military secrecy. In reality, it was being managed, controlled, manipulated. This is what makes Operation Gold such a chilling story. It was simultaneously a triumph of engineering and a catastrophe of counterintelligence, a shining example of CIA innovation and a devastating reminder of how deeply the KGB had infiltrated Western intelligence. The tunnel became a stage on which both sides played a psychological war, one digging, one listening, one pretending not to listen. And the Americans never suspected a thing. They couldn't. The operation was too successful, too smooth, too perfect. No leaks, no interruptions, no Soviet interference. The analysts at Langley celebrated every intercept as a breakthrough. Meanwhile, back in Berlin, Soviet officers walked casually over the tunnel entrance every day, aware that beneath their boots lay the most expensive secret tunnel the CIA had ever built. They simply remained silent. They were waiting. And the explosion that would expose Operation Gold to the world, the dramatic discovery that would humiliate the CIA, shock journalists, and reveal the West's most daring espionage operation, was coming far sooner than anyone in Washington realized. By the spring of 1955, the Berlin Tunnel was fully operational, humming quietly beneath the border, while CIA analysts in West Berlin scrambled to process the tidal wave of Soviet communications flooding their intercept center. unaware that nearly every message they celebrated as a breakthrough had already passed through the hands of Soviet counterintelligence planners, who were carefully shaping the information stream to appear both valuable and convincing without revealing a single critical strategic secret. In Washington, senior CIA officials congratulated themselves on achieving an unprecedented intelligence coup, believing they had finally cracked open the inner workings of the Soviet war machine, and reports from Operation Gold were circulated at the highest levels of government, including the White House, where President Eisenhower was briefed on what was described as the most significant Cold War intelligence achievement to date. But even these victories carried subtle cracks that analysts failed to notice. For example, messages intercepted through the tunnel often contain detailed troop movements, fuel shipments, supply train schedules, and political chatter, yet they rarely included the highest-level strategic directives that mattered most: intentions, nuclear posture changes, war plans, or real troop readiness alerts. And while CIA linguists chalked this up to compartmentalization inside the Soviet military, the truth was far simpler. The KGB was intentionally starving the Americans of real intelligence, while feeding them just enough data to keep them confident the tunnel was undetected. Meanwhile in London, MI6 officers were quietly celebrating as well, oblivious that their colleague, George Blake, had long since poisoned their victory. Blake attended briefings where senior SIS and CIA officers discussed the tunnel's successes, listened to their optimism, nodded politely, then walked straight to his KGB handler and relayed everything, including the exact nature of the intercepts. Blake's betrayal was so complete, so catastrophic, that the Soviets ended up with a real-time mirror of Western intelligence assessments, allowing them to see not just what the Americans heard, but how they interpreted it, how analysts cross-referenced it, and which pieces of information they considered most valuable. This gave the KGB an unprecedented advantage in the intelligence war. They could calibrate exactly how much truth to leak and how much to obscure, crafting a controlled flow of communications that painted a distorted picture of Soviet strategy while appearing entirely authentic. Yet despite Blake's warnings, the Soviets did not immediately patch or reroute their cables. To do so too abruptly would have risked tipping off the CIA that a mole existed inside MI6. Instead, they carefully managed the tunnel like a stage production, allowing some minor operational secrets to leak to maintain credibility, while withholding anything that could genuinely compromise Soviet plans. This strategy worked beautifully. Inside the CIA's Berlin base, morale soared as analysts pored over hundreds of transcripts each week, building elaborate intelligence profiles that made the Americans feel as though they were reading the Kremlin's mail daily. One CIA supervisor wrote in his report that, "For the first time, we have a window into the Soviet soul," a statement so ironic in hindsight that even former KGB officers later laughed at the absurdity of it. Meanwhile, underneath the excitement, the tunnel itself remained under constant threat, not from Soviet discovery, but from the environment. Engineers had battled groundwater seepage from the beginning, and maintaining the tunnel's structural integrity required daily inspections, careful pressure management, and constant fear that a misaligned support beam could cause the entire passage to collapse. Workers entered through the disguised warehouse in West Berlin, crawled hundreds of meters underground in near total silence, and monitored for leaks that could flood the entire structure within minutes. The risk was extreme, but the stakes were higher. Berlin was the Cold War's front line, and the Autu, Americans were willing to take almost any risk to gain even a sliver of advantage. But the KGB was patient, very patient. Soviet counterintelligence chief Oleg Gribanov one of the men overseeing the deception, believed that the longer the tunnel operated, the more embarrassing its eventual discovery would be for the West, and for nearly a year, he let the CIA build up an internal mythology around Operation Gold, a mythology of brilliance, cunning, and unprecedented success. Then, in April 1956, the Soviets decided it was time. On a quiet night, a small maintenance crew from East Berlin's state-run communication service was dispatched to inspect a suspected cable fault near a Soviet-controlled road, the exact area above the CIA tunnel. The entire event was choreographed. Soviet soldiers guarded the perimeter, while press photographers and Western intelligence observers were intentionally allowed to witness the moment. When the maintenance engineers dug down and uncovered the reinforced metal casing of the CIA's listening chamber, a flurry of staged reactions followed. Shocked expressions, hurried consultations, dramatic declarations that an espionage tunnel had been found. The discovery was treated like a crime scene. The Soviets filmed everything. At first, CIA officers in Berlin panicked, believing their greatest operation had been genuinely compromised. But within hours, senior analysts began noticing anomalies. The cables inside the chamber were still intact, untouched, and fully insulated. Too intact for a tunnel supposedly discovered randomly by maintenance workers. Soviet soldiers who examined the chamber did not appear surprised. Their reactions looked theatrical, almost rehearsed. Western journalists, stunned by the sudden discovery, rushed to print stories about the longest spy tunnel in history, while the CIA scrambled to contain the political fallout, claiming that the tunnel was merely a routine intelligence collection platform. But behind closed doors, panic set in. The operation had been blown too perfectly, too cleanly, too dramatically. It felt orchestrated. Something was wrong. Meanwhile, in Moscow, George Blake smiled quietly, having just delivered the single most devastating blow to Western technical intelligence in the early Cold War. Although the CIA tried to salvage dignity by claiming the tunnel had produced valuable intelligence before its discovery, the reality was harsher. Operation Gold had functioned entirely under Soviet supervision, and while the tunnel itself was a technical marvel, the intelligence success the CIA believed it had achieved was largely an illusion crafted by the KGB. Still, the scandal did not end with public embarrassment. The event shattered trust between the CIA and MI6, triggering suspicions that a mole existed somewhere in British intelligence. But it would take 5 more years before Blake was finally exposed, arrested, and convicted, by which time his betrayal had destroyed dozens of Western operations and compromised hundreds of agents. Operation Gold, once heralded as a landmark victory, became instead a symbol of Cold War deception, a case study in how espionage triumphs can hide catastrophic vulnerabilities, and a reminder that in the intelligence war between East and West, success often depended not on technology or engineering, but on which side possessed the more deeply embedded spy. Yet for all its failures, Operation Gold revealed a harsh truth. The CIA had underestimated its enemy, misunderstood the depth of Soviet counterintelligence, and overestimated its own ability to operate undetected in a city where every street, trench, and telephone pole was watched closely by the Stasi and KGB. It was a lesson the Americans would never forget, and one that shaped the next decade of Cold War espionage. As the dust settled after the tunnel's exposure, the CIA tried to save face by emphasizing the technical brilliance of the project, insisting that the operation had yielded invaluable intelligence. But even behind closed doors, this claim began to collapse under its own weight. When analysts took a fresh, skeptical look at the transcripts collected during the year-long operation, they began seeing patterns they had previously ignored. Patterns that now screamed deception, like the fact that nearly all high-value intercepts conveniently reinforced conclusions the CIA already believed, making the intelligence seem eerily tailored to Western expectations. Or how messages related to troop logistics provided impressive-sounding detail, but never once included anything that could alter NATO strategy in real time, such as alerts on Soviet readiness levels, missile deployments, or changes in nuclear command protocols. Even junior analysts began whispering privately that the tunnel's intelligence felt too clean, too orderly, too perfectly aligned with what the West hoped to hear. And these doubts soon reached senior CIA leadership, who realized, painfully late, that they had been outplayed in an intelligence war they believed they were winning. But the true consequences of Operation Gold stretched far beyond humiliation. It quietly reshaped the CIA's entire approach to intelligence collection. Inside Langley, a wave of insecurity swept through the organization. If the Soviets had known about the tunnel from the beginning, what else did they know? Which agents were compromised? Which operations were already dead before they started? A chilling paranoia took hold. The Berlin station, once proud of its engineering triumph, became ground zero for internal suspicion. Teams were interrogated, security procedures torn apart and rebuilt, and the agency conducted one of the deepest internal audits in its history. The simplest explanation remained the most terrifying. The Soviets had a mole, a deeply embedded one. But CIA leadership resisted this conclusion at first, partially out of denial and partially to avoid sparking panic. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the KGB celebrated the event with quiet satisfaction, analyzing the West's public statements and noting how the Americans clung desperately to the idea that the tunnel had produced meaningful intelligence. In truth, the operation had provided the CIA with thousands of pages of Soviet communications, but almost all were innocuous or intentionally misleading, giving the KGB the rare luxury of shaping Western perceptions of Soviet strength, industrial capacity, and military posture. These fake impressions influenced multiple CIA assessments over the next 2 years. In some cases, analysts underestimated Soviet production bottlenecks, believing them less severe than they truly were. In others, they overestimated Soviet logistical coordination, assuming that the Red Army's fuel and supply networks were more efficient than reality. These distortions helped the KGB conceal genuine Soviet weaknesses at a time when the USSR was still recovering from Stalin's death and reorganizing its military-industrial base. But while the KGB savored its victory, it also understood something critical. Deception at this scale was a weapon that could only be used sparingly. Exposing the tunnel had been necessary to protect George Blake, but it also risked revealing how effectively the Soviets had manipulated Western intelligence. So, Moscow crafted a narrative. The tunnel was discovered by accident. It was a maintenance mishap, nothing more. The KGB reinforced this narrative by staging public tours of the tunnel, inviting journalists to gaze upon the exposed cables and concrete supports, turning the entire structure into a Cold War tourist attraction. The West, eager to protect its own reputation, allowed this narrative to stand, even though many CIA officials privately doubted the official Soviet story. The next major shock came months later, when British intelligence, spurred by American suspicion, quietly re-examined old personnel files and operational inconsistencies. Small anomalies began pointing toward a single figure, George Blake. Blake's access to the tunnel plans, Blake's presence in meetings. Blake's immaculate record, too immaculate. Blake's political history, captured by North Koreans during the Korean War, released under mysterious circumstances, returned to the UK with no signs of trauma or stress, typical of POWs who endured harsh conditions. These red flags, ignored for years, suddenly became glaring. MI6 launched a discreet counterintelligence review, tracing Blake's movements, contacts, and behaviors. They interviewed colleagues, sifted through his travel records, and analyzed his financial activity. Nothing externally suspicious appeared, but something inside the agency felt off. Blake had always been sociable, humble, almost overly agreeable, the kind of man who blended perfectly into bureaucratic environments while revealing little of himself. The breakthrough, finally, emerged from an unexpected source, a Soviet defector who quietly informed British intelligence that one of their officers, codename Agent Diamond, had been working for the KGB for nearly a decade. The description matched Blake with frightening accuracy. MI6 confronted him in April 1961. Blake did not resist. In fact, he confessed almost immediately, calmly explaining that he had turned to the KGB after witnessing American bombing during the Korean War, convinced that capitalism was morally inferior to communism. His confession stunned his interrogators. They expected denial, defensiveness, perhaps panic, but Blake spoke openly, even proudly, describing how he had infiltrated the core of Western intelligence and delivered dozens of operations, hundreds of secrets, and thousands of names directly to the KGB. When pressed about Operation Gold, Blake described the tunnel as a magnificent idea ruined by its own ambition, a phrase that later appeared in multiple intelligence reports. He explained that he had informed his handler almost immediately after learning about the plan, and that the KGB had debated whether to shut it down before construction began. Ultimately, they allowed it to proceed as a long-term deception operation, one that would embarrass the West and protect Blake's cover simultaneously. MI6 officers sat in stunned silence. They had not merely been betrayed, they had been manipulated on a scale they had never imagined possible. Blake was sentenced to 42 years in prison, the longest term ever handed down in a British court at the time, but even his imprisonment did not end the chaos. Intelligence officers across NATO were forced to reevaluate years' worth of assessments, aware that many had been shaped by Soviet manipulation. The revelation of Blake's treachery deepened the psychological damage already inflicted by Operation Gold, reinforcing the terrifying idea that the Soviets were not just listening. They were inside the Western intelligence system itself. For both the CIA and MI6, the fallout from Blake's betrayal signaled the beginning of a darker, more suspicious era of Cold War espionage. Trust became a luxury. Every agent, every informant, every intercepted message carried the shadow of doubt. And behind that doubt stood Operation Gold, an operation that had become, in many ways, the ultimate symbol of Western overconfidence, Soviet patience, and the haunting truth that in the Cold War, the greatest failures often looked like victories until it was far too late. In the aftermath of George Blake's arrest, the CIA and MI6 scrambled to understand the full extent of the damage, holding emergency joint committees, pulling thousands of classified documents for review, and interviewing every officer who had ever worked alongside Blake. But the more they uncovered, the more horrifying the picture became. Blake hadn't just leaked Operation Gold. He had compromised dozens of agents behind the Iron Curtain, exposed British and American networks in Eastern Europe, and played a direct role in the imprisonment, torture, and execution of countless informants who believed they were helping the West push back against Soviet influence. Every name Blake surrendered was another life dismantled, another intelligence line cut, another NATO foothold shattered. For Western intelligence, realizing that their most ambitious operation had been doomed before it even began was bad enough. But realizing that one man had crippled entire branches of their espionage apparatus was devastating. Inside Langley, a silent civil war erupted between departments, each blaming the other for failing to catch Blake earlier. Some argued the CIA should have seen his odd behavior, while others insisted MI6 should never have cleared him after his release from North Korean captivity. That captivity itself became the focus of renewed analysis, interrogators going line by line through Blake's debrief records, noting how his psychological tests had been unusually clean for someone held by the North Koreans for 3 years. Senior analysts finally admitted a taboo truth. Blake's release had felt too convenient, too easy, too unlike anything experienced by other POWs, but no one had wanted to question a returning British hero at the time. Now, with the clarity of hindsight, every overlooked red flag became a flashing alarm. The British press exploded when Blake's imprisonment became public, reporting the story with a mixture of outrage and fascination. Journalists scooped up any detail they could find: how Blake infiltrated MI6, how he smuggled information to the Soviets, how he manipulated colleagues with his calm, affable personality, and the public reacted with shock. The idea that the most damaging mole in British history could appear so ordinary terrified people. Newspapers called him Britain's greatest traitor, while Soviet newspapers dismissed the Western coverage as hysterical propaganda, despite privately celebrating Blake as a hero of Soviet intelligence. Meanwhile, the KGB studied the West's response with cold precision. They watched how the CIA tightened internal controls, how MI6 restructured departments, how junior officers suddenly found themselves under intense scrutiny. Soviet analysts took notes, recording every procedural change, every new policy, every shifting pattern of behavior. The Kremlin understood something the West did not. Blake's betrayal had created lasting fear, and fear made Western intelligence predictable. Fear forced agencies to prioritize defense over offense, auditing internal security instead of expanding operations. For the KGB, the tunnel had created a ripple effect that crippled the West's espionage ecosystem more effectively than any single operation in their history. But even as the Soviets celebrated, a debate raged inside the Kremlin about how the exposure should influence future counterintelligence strategy. Argued that allowing such a large deception operation to run for so long was risky, insisting the tunnel should have been shut down immediately. Others believed the risk had been justified, pointing to the chaos unfolding across Western intelligence as proof that deception was more powerful than secrecy. Ultimately, the deception faction won, shaping KGB doctrine for years to come. They concluded that the most effective form of intelligence was not simply stealing secrets, but controlling what the enemy believed. And Operation Gold had given them the blueprint. While the intelligence war shifted globally, Berlin itself became a crucible of suspicion and tension. The tunnel's remains, preserved by the Soviets and later by East German authorities, became a silent monument to Western overreach. Soviet soldiers stationed in the sector were briefed on the tunnel as an example of American desperation, while East German propagandists used it to warn citizens about Western intrusion. Yet ironically, the tunnel also became a private embarrassment within the Soviet apparatus, a symbol of how close the KGB had come to disaster. Had the CIA discovered Blake earlier, the Soviets' entire deception strategy could have collapsed. This duality, public triumph, private fear, shaped how the USSR handled the narrative. They allowed the West to believe the tunnel's discovery was accidental, even though internally they celebrated the fact that they had controlled every phase of the operation from the beginning. Meanwhile, Blake's imprisonment created an unexpected diplomatic complication. The British government, eager to avoid humiliation, tried to keep the full details of Blake's betrayal classified, but the Americans were furious, believing that MI6 had shown catastrophic negligence in not catching Blake sooner. The episode strained the CIA-MI6 relationship, which had been one of the closest alliances in Cold War espionage. Joint operations were temporarily paused, files were withheld, suspicions grew on both sides. Some CIA officers even argued that the British were purposely hiding deeper failures, perhaps even other potential moles. This distrust lingered for years, coloring Western intelligence cooperation in subtle but meaningful ways. And while the agencies struggled to regain trust, Blake's own story took a surreal turn. In 1966, after only 5 years in prison, Blake executed one of the most dramatic escapes in British history. With the help of anti-nuclear activists and a fellow inmate, he climbed over the prison wall using a rope made from tied-together sheets, vaulted into a waiting getaway car, and disappeared into a clandestine underground network that smuggled him across Europe. MI6 was humiliated. The CIA was enraged. Within months, Blake surfaced in Moscow, where he was greeted as a hero. The Soviets awarded him medals, gave him a comfortable home, and installed him as an instructor at the KGB Academy, where he spent years teaching future agents how Western intelligence worked. His knowledge, painstakingly acquired over a decade within MI6, became invaluable to the Soviets. Meanwhile, Western intelligence agencies were forced once again to reevaluate everything they thought they had repaired after his arrest. They realized Blake's escape would embolden future espionage recruits. They realized their prison systems were not prepared to handle high-value intelligence detainees. And perhaps most painfully, they realized that Blake would spend the rest of his life actively strengthening the very enemy he had empowered for so long. But the most long-lasting consequence of Blake's escape was psychological. Inside intelligence circles, a story began circulating, a warning whispered to every new recruit that no matter how brilliant your operation seemed, no matter how carefully you planned it, no matter how many committees analyzed every detail, one traitor, one misjudgment, one failure of imagination could unravel everything. Operation Gold had shattered Western confidence once. Blake's escape shattered it again. Together, they became a permanent reminder of the Cold War's most uncomfortable truth. The enemy was not always across the border. Sometimes he sat at your table, drank your coffee, shared your jokes, and read your files. And by the time you realized the truth, the damage was already done. As the 1970s approached, the legacy of Operation Gold evolved from scandal into doctrine. The CIA built new counterintelligence divisions. MI6 implemented more rigorous psychological screening. NATO intelligence meetings now included mandatory cross-checks for mole detection. Every long-term operation underwent multiple layers of scrutiny. And still, Blake's shadow loomed. His betrayal haunted veteran officers for decades. His actions influenced how agencies trained recruits, how they vetted informants, how they structured compartmentalization. And even after the Cold War ended, long after the Berlin Wall fell, long after the KGB dissolved into the FSB, intelligence historians continued to cite Operation Gold as the ultimate warning of Cold War arrogance. A moment when the West believed it had outsmarted its enemy, only to discover it was dancing on strings, pulled by a quiet, unassuming man whose betrayal reshaped the entire trajectory of espionage history. By the mid-1970s, Operation Gold had taken on an almost mythical status inside intelligence circles, retold to new recruits as both a cautionary tale and an engineering marvel, a story that embodied everything exhilarating and everything catastrophic about Cold War espionage. But behind the dramatized retellings lay a deeper truth that haunted Western intelligence for decades. The tunnel had not simply failed, it had revealed a fundamental blind spot in how the CIA and MI6 viewed their adversaries, exposing a cultural arrogance baked into Western intelligence, an assumption that superior technology always translated to superior strategy, that cleverness could overcome caution, that the Soviets were too rigid, too paranoid, too bureaucratic to match Western daring. Operation Gold shattered those illusions completely. The tunnel proved the Soviets were not only observant, but astonishingly patient, willing to let an enemy operation unfold for more than a year to protect a single mole, willing to sacrifice thousands of inconsequential communications to paint a deceptive picture of Soviet capability, and willing to endure the humiliation of publicly discovering a tunnel they had known about since the first blueprint touched a drafting table. This patience terrified Western analysts more than the deception itself. It illuminated a mindset capable of seeing espionage in decades, not months, a mindset that approached intelligence as a psychological battlefield rather than a purely logistical one. And this shift in understanding led to one of the most striking consequences of Operation Gold: the rise of counterintelligence obsession. The CIA appointed new leadership in its fledgling counterintelligence division, a man whose paranoia would shape agency culture for decades: James Jesus Angleton. Angleton studied the tunnel's failure obsessively, convinced that if Blake existed, then there must be more moles burrowed into the West's core, and his dogmatic belief in Soviet infiltration would eventually paralyze entire sections of the CIA, leading to witch hunts, shattered careers, and operational standstills that took years to recover from. Though historians debate whether Angleton's extremism caused more harm than good, there is no question that Operation Gold was the spark that fueled his worldview. Meanwhile, the Soviets quietly incorporated the success of the tunnel deception into formal doctrine. At the KGB Academy, Blake lectured young recruits on the psychology of Western intelligence officers, explaining how the British tended to trust academic backgrounds, how the Americans admired technical expertise, and how both were prone to seeing ingenuity as invincibility. He taught recruits that the best way to undermine the West was not to stop their operations, but to subtly shape them, turning their strengths into traps. "Let them believe they are brilliant," Blake reportedly told a class in the 1970s, "and they will build their own downfall with confidence." His words became the foundation for KGB active measures strategies that flourished throughout the remaining decades of the Cold War. But as decades passed, Operation Gold started to fade from public memory, overshadowed by flashier Cold War scandals, sensational spy swaps, and nuclear standoffs. Yet inside the intelligence community, it grew more relevant, not less. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989 and East German intelligence files became accessible, Western officers finally learned just how closely monitored the tunnel had been. Stasi engineers regularly inspected the soil above, the site. Soviet officers joked privately about the American mole hole. Entire units were briefed on which cables were live, which were decoy, and which were fed fake information. There were even photographs, never seen until after the war, showing KGB officers standing directly over the tunnel path, posing casually for the camera, fully aware that dozens of CIA engineers were working beneath their boots. These revelations reopened old wounds within MI6 and the CIA. Veterans who had participated in the tunnel's planning were forced to confront the painful truth. They had been watched the entire time, not by incompetents or bureaucrats, but by adversaries who understood the game more deeply than they had ever imagined. The embarrassment resurfaced with force when journalists gained access to declassified documents, publishing exposés that reignited public interest in one of the Cold War's most audacious and humiliating intelligence failures. Younger generations, learning about Operation Gold for the first time, often saw it as a symbol of Western hubris, an example of how even the most advanced nations could be undone by a single overlooked variable: human betrayal. Meanwhile, in Russia, the story was retold as a testament to KGB brilliance, a lingering point of national pride in an era marked by political and economic upheaval. Blake himself became a quiet cultural icon within Russian intelligence circles, honored not for aggression or violence, but for his unwavering ideological commitment and his ability to cripple powerful adversaries using nothing but trust and access. His death in 2020, at the age of 98, triggered a surprising resurgence of interest in the Cold War's hidden battles. Russian officials publicly praised him, while Western newspapers re-examined his legacy with a mixture of horror, fascination, and grudging respect. Yet the most profound perspective came from intelligence professionals who reflected on how one man's ideological conviction had shaped decades of strategy and paranoia across the entire Western intelligence apparatus. And through all these years of reflection, one question remained at the heart of Operation Gold. Had the tunnel produced any useful intelligence at all? Some CIA veterans argued that minor tactical insights had been gleaned: routine communication habits, linguistic nuances, background chatter that helped refine cryptographic analysis. Others insisted the entire operation was a net loss, a colossal waste of manpower, money, and political capital. But the most balanced evaluations reached a different conclusion. The tunnel's true legacy was not informational, but transformational. It taught Western agencies that technology alone could not save them. It taught them that secrecy could not be assumed. It taught them that loyalty could not be verified by paperwork. It taught them that brilliant ideas could crumble if even one link in the chain proved weak. And in shaping these lessons, Operation Gold became something unique, not merely a failure or a humiliation, but a turning point in the philosophy of intelligence itself. In the years that followed, the CIA and MI6 increasingly embraced compartmentalization, psychological screening, internal audits, and redundancy systems, all designed to prevent another Blake. The tunnel had exposed the human vulnerabilities latent within sophisticated operations, and intelligence agencies adapted accordingly. Even after the Cold War ended, even after MI6 modernized its recruitment, even after the CIA rebuilt itself post 9/11, the specter of Operation Gold lingered in training manuals, case studies, and quiet warnings from senior officers to rookies just entering the field. And today, in an age where intelligence warfare has shifted to digital battlefields, cyber espionage, and AI-assisted surveillance, Operation Gold still holds relevance, reminding us that espionage is always, at its core, a human struggle of trust versus deception, confidence versus caution, ingenuity versus patience. The Berlin Tunnel was an engineering marvel, but it was defeated not by superior technology or brute force, but by a single individual whose quiet betrayal turned an operation of ambition into a monument of miscalculation. And decades later, the story stands as one of the most powerful lessons in modern intelligence history. No tunnel, no wiretap, no satellite, no algorithm can ever override the oldest truth of espionage. The enemy is always watching.